Okay. Recording in progress. Hallelujah.
Oh, I see. That's what goes to the same cloud.
Yeah, I don't know.
I don't know.
Everybody should just record it on the host video. Okay. I think maybe has access.
Pretty long. Give people 2 minutes. Nicole, can you try to put your slides on the screen? Make sure that works.
Sure. Can you see it in full screen?
Yep, works. Very good.
Great.
We can do that.
Oh, it disappeared.
All right. Okay, shall we start? Sure. Well, thanks everyone for coming. Unusual day, unusual time. Thanks everyone for accommodating. Complicated to organize a schedule of such a large group, but we make the best of it. And today we're pleased to welcome Nicole Lewis from Brookhaven. And Nicole is actually local. Did her undergraduate at UC Berkeley, I believe, and did her PhD with Christina Idala at the University of Michigan. And since her PhD, she's been a research associate at Brookhaven. And today she's going to tell us about baryon stopping in photonuclear collisions. So Nicole, welcome.
Thank you so much for the opportunity to give this talk. Yes, so I'm going to be talking about baryon stopping in photonuclear collisions. So I probably don't have to emphasize to this audience, but just as an introduction, one of the major goals of both Rick and the EIC is to understand the behavior of gluons within the nucleon. And attached to this is the concept of baryon number. So this is a strictly conserved quantity. The number of baryons minus the number of antibaryons is always conserved regardless of what process it is. This is a symmetry of sorts that governs the way that our universe behaves. But it's not something that we fully understand and not something that can be explained through fundamental QCD. We generally assume that the baryon number is carried by the valence quarks, where a third is split between each quark, but this is an assumption and not something that has been experimentally verified. So related to this is the concept of baryon stopping. That basically means that you measure more baryons than antibaryons, even at midrapidity. So we have this result from Brahms, where at a slightly forward rapidity, there's very clearly more protons than antiprotons. And even at rapidities perpendicular to the beamline, there's a very clear excess of protons. We just said that baryon number is something that's strictly conserved. These baryons are coming from the colliding nuclei that are being veered away from the beamline. The kinetic energy loss of those nucleons is associated with particle production. So in particles with higher in collisions with higher multiplicity, you will have more baryon stopping. But the actual mechanism behind how that actually occurs is not well understood. Here, this is an inclusive net proton yield, and that's often used when talking about baryon stopping, just because protons are a convenient particle to measure. If it's an inclusive yield, then it will also include the decays of heavier baryons like lambdas. So baryon stopping is something that's been measured at a wide range of collision energies and at a bunch of different experiments. You can see here that from this plot that it very clearly decreases as a function of collision energy. Another way of saying that is that the faster that the nucleons are traveling initially, the harder they are to stop. And even though we have all this data, the actual mechanism is not well understood. But you can see that if we take all of this central heavy ion data and plot it as a function of beam rapidity, so how fast those nucleons are traveling initially, they all fit along this trend line with an exponential fit. So on one side of this plot, we have this result from Elise looking at the P bar to P ratio in lead-lead collisions. You can see that this ratio is very clearly consistent with 1 at this LHC collision energy, whereas if we go down to RIC collision energies, there's very clearly an excess of protons, which is consistent with there being more baryon stopping at that lower collision energy. On the other side of our plot, we can go all the way down to 3 GeV. This is a recent result from STAR with the fixed target program. So you can see that the dNdy of the protons changes a lot compared to centrality. So these red points are the central collisions versus these yellow points are the more peripheral collisions. And if we take the net proton dNdy from this preliminary result, you can see that it agrees very well with our trend line right here at this lower beam rapidity. So even though we have all of this data showing that baryon stopping is a phenomenon that exists, it's not something that can be fully explained through pure string fragmentations or other ways of looking at hadronization. So one of the proposed mechanisms for baryon stopping is what's called the Baryon Junction. This is a proposed structure that exists within the nucleon. It's a Y-shaped configuration of very low momentum gluons that is attached to all 3 of the valence quarks. So this was first proposed towards the beginning of QCD as a way of constructing a gauge invariant baryon wave function. So in this theory, it's the junction that carries the baryon number and not the 3 valence quarks. And this is theorized to be an effective mechanism for baryon stopping both in proton-proton and heavy ion collisions.
Nicole, may I ask a question?
Yes.
So I'm gonna pick on one word which consists of one letter, the word A. Proposed says a way. Are there other ways to construct a gauge invariant baryon that people have been able to put together? Maybe that's an unfair question, that's kind of a heavy theory question, but why did you write a way, or it's just sort of generic?
To be honest, I made this slide a long time ago and I don't remember. I think presumably there would be other ways of constructing this gauge invariant baryon wave function. I don't know what they would be.
Okay, I didn't mean to derail your talk. Sorry. It struck me the way you phrased it, which is of course correct. It just makes me wonder whether there are, theoretical limitations to what the possibilities are. But okay. Yeah.
I guess I wouldn't want to say the way because then I might get more questions about that. So I was trying to avoid them.
That would be super interesting. But okay, let's go on. Thanks.
So the Baryon junction is something that is well grounded in Reggie theory, but certainly this kind of structure appears in other parts of QCD. So in lattice QCD has talked about a Y-shaped baryon flux tube of gluons, which is what binds the 3 valence quarks together. This is something that is still under investigation in the lattice community. In terms of baryon stopping, the reason that we argue that this junction would is a good mechanism for explaining baryon stopping is because it carries such a low momentum fraction. And when you're talking about the amount of time needed for the target to interact with the projectile, for when we're talking about quarks, the amount of time required for that interaction to happen, we don't know exactly what it is. QCD is very complicated, but it's certainly set by the distance between those quarks, which is on average about 1 Fermi. If we're talking about, say, a proton-proton collision, where the proton beam has, where the proton has 100 GeV of momentum, then that valence quark will be carrying about 1/3 of that momentum. And so the actual collision time that those quarks have to interact is much smaller than what we estimate would be needed for baryon stopping to actually occur, versus the junction. So you can see in this cartoon, the valence quarks, their X range is, they're very highly Lorentz contracted. And so the actual length that they have to interact is very squished compared to these soft partons, where the baryon number could be held, which are much wider. And so they have a much more time to interact, or have much longer length scales to overlap and to actually have time to be stopped. But no signature of the baryon junction has been cleanly identified in experiment. So that's the baryon stopping part of my title. I'm going to move on to the photonuclear part. So I'm going to be talking about inclusive particle production in photonuclear collisions. So this is where one heavy ion emits a photon, which then interacts with the other heavy ion. This is similar to an EA collision at the EIC, except for the photon virtuality is much smaller. And this is a relatively simple process compared to other heavy ion collisions. And so it can be used to study bulk properties like collectivity from initial state effects and also hadron chemistry. So these photons are actually a feature of these heavy ions being highly charged objects. When they are accelerated to close to the speed of light, they produce these large electromagnetic fields. The electric field actually becomes almost perpendicular to the magnetic field. And so with the equivalent photon approximation, we know that in a specific phase space, this electromagnetic field can actually be quantized as a flux of quasi-real photons. So quasi-real meaning very low virtuality. And so it's recently been confirmed that in ultraperipheral collisions at RIC and the LHC, the equivalent photon approximation holds. So we can treat these as quasi-real photons. When I say ultraperipheral collision, what I mean is that the distance between these two heavy ions is so far such that they're not actually overlapping when they collide. And so they're instead interacting through the electromagnetic fields. And these photons have, so STAR has recently measured photon-photon to E plus E minus collisions and confirmed that these photons do in fact behave like quasi-real photons, and in fact, they're linearly polarized. So a lot of times when we talk about photonuclear collisions, we're talking about vector Meson photoproduction. So in a photonuclear collision, one of the heavy ions is emitting a photon, which is then interacting with the other. In this case, it's a semi-exclusive process. It is only producing a single vector Meson. So here is a recent result from the ELISE collaboration looking at coherent J-psi photoproduction. So coherent, meaning that the photon is interacting with the entire nucleus and it's not breaking up. And so these are sensitive to the transverse gluonic structure at very low X versus an incoherent process where the heavy ion would break up and the photon is only interacting with a single nucleon. What I'm going to be discussing in this talk is inclusive photonuclear collisions. So here the photon interacts with the heavy ion and produces a wide range of different particles. So this can occur through either the direct process, where the photon interacts directly with the nucleus, or through the resolved process, where the photon fluctuates into a quark-antiquark hadronic state, which then interacts with the nucleus. And this is what at RIC and LHC energies happens the vast majority of the times, is these photonuclear collisions occur through this resolved process. So there have been some recent measurements of inclusive photonuclear collisions at both CMS and the LHC. They're taking advantage of this asymmetric collision topology. So on one side, we have a photon, and on the other side, we have particle production and this heavy ion breaking up and a large amount of particles being produced. So here is a result from CMS of proton-lead collisions. So in this case, the photon can only come from the lead nucleus. The photons are produced by an electromagnetic field, and a lead nucleus is carrying a lot more charge compared to a single proton. So the photon is traveling in this direction, and there is very little event activity on that side. And then the proton breaks up and creates a large amount of particles going into the other side. And so this was the first measurement of long-range particle correlations in photon-proton interactions. So you can see this is their measurement for V2, but they also measured V3. And what they found, so the proton-lead collisions are in red, and the photon-proton collisions are in blue. So they found correlations that are consistent with a model, in this case Pythia, which does not include collective effects. So they're not claiming collectivity in photon-proton interactions at this time, but certainly the error bars of this measurement are large, and it's something that requires further investigation. So ATLAS has also measured inclusive photonuclear collisions in lead-lead. So in this case, the photon could be traveling in either direction. They distinguish the photon going side by requiring that there are 0 neutrons traveling in this direction, and then at least 1 neutron is traveling in the lead going side. And then they further enhance their photonuclear sample with what are called rapidity gaps. So they measure this quantity, sigma, gamma, delta, eta, completely rolls right off the tongue. So this is basically a measurement of how far the particles are on each side of how far apart the particles are on the photon going side of the detector. So on this side, this quantity is 5, so that's almost the complete eta distribution of ATLAS. And you can see that it has a very sharply falling distribution with multiplicity compared to where this number is lower, and the rapidity, the multiplicity distribution is much wider. And so they employ a cut on this quantity and require that it's greater than 2.5. So there's a large rapidity gap, and that's how they isolate their photonuclear collisions. And through this, they were able to probe collectivity from initial state effects. So these are long-range correlations. So the V2 and V3 are the filled-in points on this plot, and you can very clearly see that they are non-zero, which is exciting. There's indications of collectivity, of collective motion in these photonuclear events. Another interesting feature of this plot is for V3, you can see that the photonuclear V3 is a very comparable size compared to other small system collectivity in proton-proton and proton-lead, compared to the V2, which is significantly smaller. So if we look at this V2 in terms of transverse momentum, you can see that it has a very similar trend compared to the small systems. It has sort of this arc shape, but it's very clearly less than the smaller systems. And this is something that can be explained in the context of the color glass condensate model when we talk about color domains. So in the idea behind this is that you have small parts of the nucleon in which the color is correlated, which is indicated by these little color blobs. And so the amount of these color domains that you interact with is going to affect the amount of correlation that you measure in your final state. So if you have a smaller projectile, then you're only interacting with a few of these domains, and you will see a much larger correlation compared to if you have a larger projectile, like in photonuclear collisions, where you're interacting through that resolved process. So you're interacting through a color dipole, and the projectile is actually larger compared to a proton-lead collision. So you're hitting more of these color domains, and so some of this correlation gets washed out, and you measure a smaller V2. So certainly something interesting that will be continued to be measured both at LHC and RIC.
Sorry, Nicole, may I ask a question?
Yes, please.
So V2 is a correlation momentum space.
Mm-hmm.
So when you say correlate color domains, what exactly is correlated, and how does that turn into correlations of momentum space?
So these are local correlations, I think of, I'm not exactly sure, but I think it's of the gluons. They're sort of correlated in a particular momentum direction, I think is the idea, but yeah, that's a good question.
Spencer has a question.
Yeah, since we're asking about this, you said that, you know, the projectiles in gamma p are large, with photons are larger than protons. Do you know what the distribution of dipole sizes is that's relevant for this measurement?
I don't know. That I don't know. But it has been, there is a new theory paper from the BNL and Wayne State group that looked into this. So I could look that up and send it to you. I don't think it made it into my backup.
Okay, thanks.
Thanks.
Fareed has some more questions. This is Nicole's the nature of it. I should have warned you that people just interrupt, so that's how it goes. Go ahead, Fareed.
Yes, just a comment. I think Nicole described well what's happening in the CEC. It's the chromoelectric fields that have given direction within these domains, and that chromoelectric field is what leads to this anisotropy. It's not exactly the gluons, but the fields.
Okay. That makes more sense.
So there's a coherent field, and that gives some momentum correlation of the decay products.
Yeah, that's roughly the idea. But it's a bit cartoonish, of course, right?
Yeah. Okay, thanks.
Yeah, thank you for the clarification. Okay, so this is looking at correlations, but Atlas also has looked at the dye-jet cross-section in photonuclear events. So here, if you're looking at two separate jets, you can more or less reconstruct the kinematics of what is going on. And so you can get back to the Bjorkine X of what you're probing in the nucleus. And the nice thing about looking at photonuclear collisions at LHC energies is you can, the photon has a relatively large energy compared to RIC. And so you can reliably produce two jets, which you can measure. And so this is something that is sensitive to nuclear PDFs and probing nuclear structure. Of course, we'll be able to do a much cleaner version of this at the EIC, but this is a what we can measure now and what we can get ready for as we prepare for measuring nuclear structure at the EIC. So photonuclear collisions in the context of the Baryon Junction. So here we're measuring baryon stopping in the cleanest possible process. So this photon, as we talked about before, is fluctuating into this quark-antiquark pair. It would not be able to stop a baryon if the baryon number was carried by all three valence quarks. But if instead it was carried by the junction, we can imagine that this, as this cartoon shows, this quark-antiquark pair pulls the junction out of this target baryon, which is in red. That target baryon has a bunch of leftover quarks, which then fragment into mesons. that junction gets pulled to mid-rapidity and produces a baryon at mid-rapidity, which could have a different flavor because it's not carrying the quarks with it. And so there's a predicted rapidity distribution with this baryon junction mechanism. The problem with trying to measure this in proton-proton or heavy ion is you don't have a clear way of distinguishing what is the target nucleon, what direction the target nucleon is traveling in, versus in photonuclear collisions, we have a very clear asymmetric event, and we know that the target nucleon came from the nucleus that broke up. Another nice thing about photonuclear collisions is that it's specifically probing the nucleon at low X. So this photon is a relatively small color dipole, and so it has a very small cross-section when it comes to interacting with the 3 valence quarks, but it is very good at probing the nucleon at low X where it is dominated by gluons, and so it enhances the fraction of this baryon junction mechanism. So these measurements are done at the Relativistic Heavy Ion Collider at Brookhaven National Lab, where I work. So the STAR experiment is here at 6 o'clock. The STAR experiment is known for many things, but one of them is robust tracking and particle identification. So this is done with a combination of the time projection chamber, which allows us to do track reconstruction and also identify particles using ionization energy loss, and then also the time of flight detector, which extends our particle identification capabilities. So the time projection chamber is full of ionizing gas. As charged particles travel through that ionizing gas, some of those electrons are let out. We collect those electrons and then project how that traveled in time. We are time projecting within the chamber, but those charged particles are also losing energy as they travel through. And the nice thing is that that energy loss depends both on the particle's momentum, which we can measure, and on that particle's mass. And so we're able to describe this behavior through a Bischel formula and then very clearly identify. Here is a measurement, a relatively low collision energy. This is from a paper that was studying deuterons. So that's why they emphasize where the deuteron curve is. But we can also very clearly see separation between protons, kaons, and pions. This is true for lower PT. As you can see at higher PT, all these curves sort of smash into each other. And so STAR has an additional particle identification detector called the time of flight, which extends our particle identification capabilities to higher PT. We're able to measure the mass of those particles. So we have the momentum and the track length information that comes from the TPC as the particle travels through, and then it hits. We get very precise timing information from the top, in which we're able to reconstruct the mass. So we can very clearly see where these deuterons are on this graph, and also very clear separation between the protons, kaons, and pions. So in terms of selecting these photonuclear events, we're using sort of a similar technique to what was used at the LHC, looking at rapidity gaps. STAR, unfortunately, doesn't have quite the acceptance of ATLAS or CMS. So instead, we use our forward detectors in order to look at the different event activity. So here we're looking at the same cartoon of baryon stopping that I was pointing to earlier. We're just highlighted what all of the different behavior corresponds to different detectors in STAR. So in this diagram, this is from simulation. This is an EA simulation called Beagle. We've limited the kinematics of the photons such that they match photonuclear collisions. So here, the photon is traveling in the east direction. Yes, at STAR, we typically put the east on the left side and west on the right side. I've now stared at these plots enough that this makes a lot of sense to me, and maps have become more confusing. It's probably fine. So on the photon going side, we require that we measure one neutron, and then we require a gap inactivity in that photon going direction. So no protons are traveling on that side. And then on the gold going side, we require that we measure multiple neutrons and then a lot of activity in those forward detectors. And STAR, for its minimum bias trigger, for a lot of the large data sets, it requires coincidence in our vertex plane detector. So that's this VPD, this green shape here. Because it requires coincidence between these two, it completely kills our signal. And so we had some trouble looking through to find which particular data set we could use. And luckily, there was a data collected in 2017, which instead also required coincidence in the ZDC. And so we could use this for our measurement. It's not typically, a lot of STAR data is taken at 200 GeV, not at 54. But the very nice thing about this data set is that you can see this peak here. These are the protons and neutrons that are spectators from this nucleus that is breaking up. They very nicely fall along our detector acceptance. At higher collision energies, this gets shifted over. And we would have to use a different technique in order to isolate these photonuclear collisions. So that ended up working out.
Sorry, Nicole, can you say again? I didn't quite follow what the trigger was on these data. Can you say explicitly what the trigger was?
So for this particular data set, it's either coincidence in the ZDC or coincidence in the VPD. But in the for future data sets, STAR is planning on just using coincidence in the ZDC.
So you do require a forward neutron in both directions?
Yes.
So you even require the gold that's shaking off the photon to break up?
Yeah, so this gold nucleus gets excited, and when it's emitting a photon, it also emits a neutron or several neutrons.
You may not know the answer, but Spencer might. Is it possible to just trigger on a single ZDC, or is that too much of a mess and you'll never sort it out? Too much background.
Well, I don't. Nicole, do you want me to answer? Or do you want to comment on that, or?
I don't think it's possible, but you would know more than I would.
We looked at. I mean, we looked at this in the early days of UPCs and STAR, and it was. You could do it. In fact, we even had a trigger that did not require either ZDC. The problem is the selectivity is very low, and that most of the events you get are garbage. So you're digging through an awful lot of chaff for not that much wheat, and we decided that requiring both ZDCs, you lost a lot of signals, but it was much cleaner. I should also say, that the way you can get an excited gold nucleus here relatively cheaply is by exchanging an additional photon. I don't think it's very likely that photon emission leads to nuclear excitation. Just the kinematics are that photon in the emitter frame is so soft it doesn't really matter. But you can have an additional photon which excites a nucleus.
Okay, thank you.
Go ahead. Yeah.
Okay. In terms of requiring one neutron in the ZDC, so here we're looking at the ADC distribution out of the ZDC. This is for 54 GeV. The STAR ZDCs were not designed for this energy level. If we were looking at a 200 GeV plot, these bumps would be much more divided, but certainly it's a fit that we're able to do. It's good enough for figuring out where our cuts are. So this red peak here corresponds to the energy consistent with one neutron, and then we have 2 neutrons, 3, 4, and so on. These are low multiplicity events that were collected using the ZDC triggers. And so on the photon going side, we require that there is only 1 neutron. And then on the gold going side, we would require that there are multiple neutrons. So we apply all of these different cuts with requiring the neutrons, requiring the asymmetry in terms of event activity, and we would expect to see a asymmetric distribution of particles produced within our central detector, where we would expect to see more particles produced on the gold going side. And in fact, that is what we see. So in this blue curve, the photon is traveling in the east direction, and we have more particle production on the other side, versus this red curve, the photon is traveling in the opposite direction, and we have more particle production on the other side. So if we look at the multiplicity distribution, so the vast majority of our photonuclear enriched sample has a multiplicity consistent with very peripheral gold-gold collisions. And so as a baseline comparison, we're also performing particle identification in peripheral events with that have a centrality of 60 to 80%. Of course, we're probably going to have some contamination from peripheral events, particularly at a multiplicity of 7 for heavy ion physics. That doesn't sound like a lot, but for photonuclear collisions, certainly that sounds like a lot of particles. And so we have to figure out a way of estimating this contamination from peripheral collisions. So we do this by looking at the ADC distributions of the ZDC. So these are our photonuclear enriched events in which I've applied all of the cuts except for the one neutron cut. So that's represented by this vertical blue band. So all of the events to the left of this vertical band are our photonuclear enriched events. And then we're looking at how the how that distribution is shaped within the ZDC. We then look at the shape of the distribution for peripheral AA events, and then scale down that distribution such that the tails match. And this is how we estimate our background contamination. And so from here, we can conservatively estimate that the contamination is about 15%. So here we've finally gotten to the point where I'm showing you results. So here we're looking at double ratios. So this red point is the proton to pi plus ratio in photonuclear enriched events divided by the same ratio in peripheral AA. There are a lot of features to this plot, some of which were expected, some of which were not. So our K to pi ratios are less than 1 and flat with PT. This is consistent with having less access to strangeness in photonuclear events. The fact that the proton to pi ratios are steeper than the K to pi ratios is consistent with there being larger radial flow in our peripheral AA events. And so that that makes the denominator lower. So it pushes the double ratio up at low PT. What we were not expecting to see is that the antiproton to pi minus double ratio is very clearly less than the proton to pi ratio for PT less than 1. So this is an indication of soft baryon stopping in photonuclear collisions. This becomes a little bit more clear when we look at the antiparticle to particle ratio. So again, these are double ratios. The yellow is the pi minus to pi plus ratio in our photonuclear enriched events divided by the same ratio in the peripheral AA. You can see that the pion and kaon ratios are flat and consistent with 1 compared to the p bar to p ratio that clearly falls off for PT less than 1, indicating that not only is there soft baryon stopping present in photonuclear collisions, but it is something that is stronger. It is a stronger effect in photonuclear collisions compared to hadronic collisions with a comparable multiplicity. And when we compare with Pythia, so this is a Pythia simulation in which we've limited the kinematics of the photon to represent photonuclear collisions. So these are single ratios, but you can see that Pythia tells us that these ratios should be flat and consistent with 1 within uncertainty, versus here where we have a very clear fall off. If we think about these results in the context of the Baryon Junction, again, this photon is fluctuating into a quark-antiquark pair, which would not be able to stop the baryon if the baryon number was carried by all three valence quarks. But instead, we can imagine that this quark-antiquark pair is interacting directly with the baryon junction. And the fact that this double ratio decreases at PT less than 1 is consistent with the fact that we expect that this is a non-perturbative effect, and so it should affect smaller momentum. And there's a predicted distribution for the baryon junction and how the dn/dy should change as a function of rapidity. So if we look at—
So Nicole, quick question. These are super interesting data. And I hear your words about non-perturbative, but 1 GeV is pretty darn soft. And it's kind of turned off at 1 GeV. Is there, maybe you'll show calculations. I mean, is there some explanation why it's really, in fact, it's really limited to below 1 GeV?
So there are no calculations for this. We don't know. Some speculation has been that 1 GeV is about the mass of the proton, so that's something that could be affecting it. But we don't know at this stage.
Okay. So very striking effect.
Yes.
Okay.
So if we think about this rapidity distribution in terms of Pythia does expect to see a net proton dn/dy that would have a steeper slope compared to the net kaon and net pion. It expects the slope to be about 2.5. If we think about, so the prediction from baryon stopping, it predicts that the slope should be about 0.5. If we compare to our fit that I showed previously, so this is a fit that found the exponential slope to be about 0.61. So that's indicated by this green band. So this is something that we will measure. We will measure the net proton dn/dy in photonuclear collisions. I'm working hard on that measurement right now. Unfortunately, it's not ready to show today, but it will be ready we are planning on showing it publicly at DIS at the end of March. But I can show you this double ratio as a function of rapidity. So again, this is the P bar to P ratio in photonuclear events divided by the same ratio in our peripheral AA events. So at high PT, you can see that this ratio is consistent with 1. So that's what we saw before when we integrated over rapidity. In the backward direction, in that photon going direction, so that's those red and orange points, the ratio is slightly bigger than 1. So we have slightly less baryon stopping in photonuclear collisions compared to peripheral AA. Another way of saying that is that the nucleons aren't being slowed down enough to the point that they're traveling backwards. But as we go to more and more forward rapidity and lower PT, you can see that this ratio gets smaller, and we have, which is consistent with more baryon stopping happening in the gold going direction. And this is consistent with what we would expect for the baryon junction mechanism. There's some details that might be hiding within this double ratio. Photonuclear events are an asymmetric system, and we're comparing that with peripheral AA, which is symmetric. And so the center of mass of these two different processes is different. And so that's why we're working on having the fully detector effect corrected yields, which will be ready soon. But for now, we'll have to contend with double ratios. So another possible way of investigating the baryon junction mechanism is by comparing charge stopping to baryon stopping. So we're not debating that the valence quarks are very important within baryons and that they carry the electric charge. That's not something that we are disputing. And so if we could measure charge stopping, so the net charge that is produced in the collision, so you could imagine constructing an observable something like pi plus, k plus, proton minus, pi minus, k minus, antiproton. We could compare that with the net amount of baryons that are produced. So the same thing, looking at the differences in proton minus antiproton versus neutron minus antineutron. And we could compare these two different observables. If it was the valence quarks that were carrying both the electric charge and also the baryon number, then these should be the same. The problem is we don't know how big the difference will be. And here in this particular observables, we're proposing measuring multiple different types of particles, each of which are coming with their own detector effects. And there's also physics complications that come when we're talking about heavy ion physics. So this is certainly a very challenging measurement and something that may or may not be sensitive to the nuances that we're trying to look for in the Baryon Junction mechanism. But luckily, STAR has what we call the Isobar data set. So this was something that was taken in 2018, looking at ruthenium-ruthenium collisions versus zirconium-zirconium. So these are isobars. They have the same number of total neutrons and protons, but ruthenium has 44 protons compared to zirconium, which only has 40. So this was a very high statistics run, which was designed to minimize the systematics between the two data samples. So we switched between the collision systems every few hours, and we worked very hard to keep the luminosities level. And so this data set is specifically designed to measure the effects of electromagnetism on heavy ion physics, and also specifically designed to construct double ratios. And so we can instead measure the difference in the net charge versus ruthenium minus zirconium, and estimate that in terms of double ratios, and come up with a measurement that is much more precise. And so if the valence quarks carry both the baryon number and also the electromagnetic charge, then we would expect to have this relationship. So the baryon stopping is going to be the same regardless of the collision species. We have the same amount of baryons going in, same amount of baryons coming out. We would expect the net charge to change based off of the difference in protons. And so we would expect this, this relationship that the net baryons times the difference in the number of protons, so 4, divided by the total number of nucleons, 96, should equal this difference in charge stopping between ruthenium and zirconium. So I don't have the results ready to show. Again, these will be ready for GIS. I can show you double ratios. So here is the pi plus to pi minus double ratio in ruthenium divided by zirconium. You can see that the double ratios for pions and protons are larger than 1, probably due to the extra charge present in the ruthenium, versus the kaon double ratio, which is consistent with 1 within uncertainties. So we can take these double ratios and do sort of a back of the envelope calculation based off of recently published data, and estimate that this indicates that the baryon stopping is larger than the net charge stopping. We will have the preliminary results ready to show soon. But certainly this is interesting, and I hope to have a more interesting plot to show you soon. But we still need to work on reducing the uncertainties, and also there is probably some effect due to nuclear structure. The protons and neutrons within ruthenium versus zirconium are distributed differently. And so that's going to affect, that's certainly going to have an effect when we're comparing charge stopping versus baryon stopping. So zooming out now into a greater context of nuclear physics. So I've brought up the Electron Ion Collider a few times in this talk, but this is something that we are very much looking forward to, that will be built at BNL using the same tunnels that Rick currently uses. Particle identification is going to be a very important part of the program at the EIC. I'm showing you two plots that are over a year out of date. This is from the ECHE and Athena proposals. So these were two separate proposals for a detector at the EIC. They're currently being combined into the EPIC experiment proposal, which will hopefully have up-to-date plots that I can show you soon. So this is all of the various detectors that were and kinematic coverage that were proposed through the ECHE collaboration. And here's a plot from the Athena barrel top showing how well that it can separate out protons for a very wide range of momentum and really expand the capabilities of particle identification at the EIC. And when we do these measurements of particle identification in photonuclear collisions, they can prepare us for what types of things will be interesting at the EIC. And if we're going to be measuring baryon stopping at the EIC, we need to be able to measure protons for a wide range of momentum. So I'll now summarize. I studied identified particle spectra in photonuclear collisions. We observed baryon stopping at low PT, which is possible evidence of a baryon junction existing inside the nucleon. Our next step is to measure the net proton dNdy and look at how that changes versus rapidity. And identified particle measurements in photonuclear collisions will inform the possible measurements that we can do at the EIC, which is certainly something important to think about as we're getting ready to design the next generation of particle detectors. Thank you.
Thank you, Nicole. Very interesting measurements and interesting prospects. We had some discussion. Let's see. Questions online? I see applause. Any questions online? Spencer.
Yep. Very nice talk, Nicole. Thanks. Very thought-provoking. I had a question. You did comparisons of data with Pythia, and I was wondering how you had normalized the two, because the photon spectra are different. And I guess another related question is, what is the distribution of the photon nucleon center of mass energies in these samples?
So the photon has an energy that goes up to 2 GeV, we estimate. And then the
2 GeV in the lab, in which frame?
In the lab frame.
Okay.
And then the nucleon has half of 54 GeV, so 27 GeV.
Right, but what is that spectrum? The energy photon energy, that's the maximum energy, and there's kind of a 1/k spectrum, and and then that gets folded in with the acceptance. And so, what is the center of mass energy, gamma T center of mass energy spectrum for this data you're showing us?
Yeah, so yeah, the vast majority of our photons have much lower energy than 2 GeV. So the center of mass energy is more around 27 GeV. Does that answer your question?
Not completely. Because the photon energy, there's no, it's 1/k, and then combining with the nucleus, and so that would give you like a 1/√k spectrum for W gamma P. But then there's acceptance effects, and it'd be very interesting to see the center of mass energy spectrum for these events after the cuts, etc.
Okay, yeah, that's not something that we've looked into, but that's something that we can.
And also, I mean, the question is, does Pythia agree with it? And I suspect the agreement might not be that great.
Okay.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Questions in the room? Oh, so I have actually an experimental question. It struck me, you had this nice plot at the beginning showing that, I think it was like the rapidity shift versus rapidity gap for all kinds of hadronic collisions is exponential falling. It was one of the early slides. Just this compendium. There we go. I see it. Oops. Yeah, that one. Yeah. So honestly, I had my fingers in a couple of these, especially the NA49 one. That's years and years ago, and we were always bedeviled. And there was this. You may be familiar with this kind of puzzle of proton spectra from Phoenix versus star. And this question of feed down from lambdas. That's a real kind of nuts and bolts experimental question. It may or may not be relevant to photonuclear production. As you're talking, I'm trying to wonder, I couldn't really answer it for myself. Certainly for hadronic collisions, it's always a kind of a tricky business how much you correct. So here, I would guess it's a sort of a little heterogeneous. Maybe I'll just stop. I'll let you answer. I mean, is that an issue in your measurement? Is it an issue in comparing to peripheral, gold collisions? How does that come in? Or do you think it's kind of a secondary systematic effect?
So we're specifically using an inclusive proton sample because we want the effects of those weak decays. We want we want to have the effects of heavier baryons. We don't have the statistics to directly measure lambdas, but but they can be included in our proton sample. And so these are all inclusive protons.
It does smear the kinematics. It may be a minor effect, but it's not. It kind of gives an imprecision to the measurement.
Yes, it does give an imprecision to the measurement. It's also something that changes with collision energy.
Right.
So yeah, it's another detail to consider when looking at this plot.
So would you classify as a kind of a secondary detail? It doesn't really affect your measurement in a primary way?
Yes.
All right. Okay, any more questions? Seeing none, let's thank Nicole again. Thank you very much, Nicole. And everyone can go on to the next thing they have to do today. Thank you.
Busy day.
Oh, yeah, still. Coffee pot upstairs, yeah.
All right. We're still on.
I was saying it out loud, so I actually remembered to do it.